these things are always quite tricky to work through, but I think that in Frank's book and in the discussion we've had about tolerance, and as Lisa alluded to, one aspect that comes through is the focus on ideas and thinking and the judgment and the struggle for the truth. And also in the book, it's a focus not so much on ideas, but on the centrality today of behaviour and actions, our external manifestations, and whether we're able to tolerate certain behaviours and actions. And I want to sort of like draw out the difference between those, possibly, and also mention something just briefly about agency. And because I think that I have a slightly different take to Frank in terms of how these discussions work out today. And I don't think that the discourses of tolerance and limits and the problems of freedom are necessarily manifested in terms of our ideas and our thoughts. I don't think it's like the days of left and right and extreme ideas. I think it's much more about our behaviour, how we behave towards each other. Even something like, I think there's an example in here about the way that, say, classrooms and academia regulated. And I'm not often accused of academic bullying, but it does sometimes come up. You're in a heated engagement, in an argument, and I think what people might argue, if they're referring not to me but someone else, it's not so much about the ideas. I think it's about the way that people are behaving, and that the behaviour is somehow undermining our consensual framework. It's not so much that someone is saying something is right or saying something problematic. Anyway, what I want to argue is, why is it, I think, that the tolerance discourse and the limits has shifted towards our behaviour and our actions, rather than ideas, which is the traditional discussion of tolerance around religious beliefs and political ideas. And secondly, I think I want to raise the problematic of agency, because in a traditional liberal discourse, the way of dealing with the regulation and the lack of tolerance is that we inculcate our own agency as subjects. And we, as Frank does, we talk about Hannah Arendt's work, and about how through our intersubjective agency we constitute a community, we freely engage with an issue, whether we want to call it politics or science or academia. And it's through our own agency and what we construct with our own agency that we extend the sphere of toleration and of freedom. And I don't read the world of the diminished subject and the victim culture, and that we're all too weak and we need to be protected, that the state is regulating our lives because of our weakness. To me, the restrictions and our inability to be tolerant stem from an idea that we actually do have agency, that our agency needs to be inculcated, that today states can't necessarily protect us and regulate us or know what's right and wrong. And it seems to me that when we talk about the big society or other things, what governments are saying is that moral independence and moral autonomy is crucial. There's no broader narrative governments can't provide. Us as individuals have to be able to be making our decisions and be morally autonomous. And so I think, and I haven't worked it through, which is one of the reasons, and who has, but that's why it's good to talk about these things, is I think that there's something shifted from a traditional liberal discussion about individuals and states. And what I want to briefly suggest is that it's not so much that we've lost although it's true, it's not just that we've lost the sense of ourselves as agents and we need protecting. I want to also argue that we've lost our sense of understanding of an outside world, and that that we can only have freedom and moral autonomy, as Frank says, when we're engaged in a process of clarification, when there is a gap between our actions and our behaviour and the world as it appears, or the final outcomes. And that process is one that we can engage with knowingly. And that way we have the freedom to err, the freedom to make mistakes, the freedom to fail, because we're continually learning. We're engaged in that process where you need freedom and tolerance. And what I want to suggest is that today there is no longer that gap. And that's why we have a problem with ideas of autonomy and also with freedom. And I think there's no gap because of the thing called globalization. And often we understand globalization as there is no gap literally between our action and behavior and outcomes. And I want to flag up and ask Frank about, because I hardly, it's good to have discussions with real people and everything, is that I think globalization says that we can't understand the gap. There is a gap, but we can no longer know it and understand it and intervene in it. It's a bit like the butterfly flaps its wings. There might be a hurricane somewhere, not necessarily immediately, could be 100 years later or something, but once that thing has happened, the consequences are there. And when I have friends or I'm talking to people, it seems to me that they're very much aware that their actions and behaviour have consequences that they can't do much about. I'm talking to a friend of mine about their parenting, which I know Frank writes about, and he's really worried because he thinks that one time not letting the child do something or telling them off or being too angry is going to have a permanent consequence. And when people talk about global warming, they say whatever we do now will have a permanent consequence. And when we talk about health and our own health, we say you might smoke when you're younger, you might not exercise, you might smoke, take all these risks, but they will have a permanent consequence that you can't undo later. And the more that we live in a world where it seems our actions and behaviour have permanent consequences we can't change, where there's no longer a capacity for freedom and for moral autonomy. And what I want to suggest is that in a globalised world where complexity takes over from a human focus, either we read back from the world and we say, that if you do this, if you smoke, if you parent badly, whatever, that you're going to have to be responsible. We have responsibility, but there's no moral autonomy, because it's as if we've scientifically read backwards to say that's right or that's wrong. There's no possibility of moral autonomy. And on the other hand, it seems that a lot of the world is too complex, and who knows what will be the consequences of our actions. But in that case, you can't have moral autonomy either. You can only have moral autonomy and freedom and be able to tolerate in that space that Frank talks about in a world of an ongoing process between us as humans individually and collectively and an outside world. And what I want to suggest is that I want to raise our understanding of globalization and complexity, then dividing the world into how we judge behaviors and actions, and either we're just right and wrong, or no one knows, but in either of those cases there's no possibility of moral independence. Anyway, that's my take.